My name is Vanessa Clark, and if you are listening to me right now, then you should know this is not just another story but a warning, a confession, and a final stand from a woman who spent too many years living in the shadows of fear and silence. And before I take you into the moment when everything changed, I need you to do one thing for me, because stories like mine are not entertainment, they are lifelines. So hit subscribe right now and stay with me, because what I am about to share might help someone you love, or maybe even save you too. And now that we are here together, let me tell you how the knock at 8:12 became the sound of my husband Terrence losing everything he thought he owned, including me, because this morning I sat at my dining table with a swollen lip and a bruise that stretched across my cheek like a violent signature, and for the first time in years I did not feel fear, I felt fire, and I felt purpose, and I felt the weight of every night I cried melting into something stronger than survival, something sharp, something final. And while the house stood quiet and the sun slid through the blinds like pale gold shining on the wedding china I had laid out, I waited for Terrence to come downstairs, believing that after last night I would bow my head and shrink like I always did. And when he walked in smirking at the bruise he had created, I knew the clock was ticking for him and not for me, because at exactly 8:12 the knock came. The knock that told him his reign was over. The knock that told me freedom had arrived. When the knock echoed through the house at exactly 8:12, Terrence froze like someone had ripped the floor out from under him, and I watched the shift in his eyes, the way panic crawled over his skin like a living thing, because for the first time in years he did not know what was about to happen, and he did not have control. And there was a dark, quiet satisfaction rising inside me as I stood there with my swollen lip and bruised cheek, because the world he built on fear was finally cracking, and he could feel it too. I could tell from the way his fingers twitched against the edge of the table and the way he tried to swallow, but the sound caught in his throat, and he tried to sound confident when he said, "Vanessa, who is at the door?" But his voice trembled just enough for me to hear the truth, and the truth was simple. He was scared not of the knock itself but of the idea that someone might finally see what he truly was. And as I turned toward the hallway, I did not rush. I kept my steps slow, steady, deliberate, the way a person walks when they are no longer the hunted but the one leading the moment. And I could sense him behind me, standing from his chair, hovering, unsure if he should follow or sit or pretend nothing was happening. And his confusion was almost poetic, because for years I had been the one trapped in confusion, the one trying to understand how love had turned into something sharp, something hurtful, something violent. And now, for the first time, Terrence felt even a fraction of what he had given me, and I let him feel it, because the knock at the door was not danger for me, it was deliverance. I reached the foyer, placed my hand on the doorknob, breathed in once deeply, and prepared to open the door to the truth.
I opened the door, and the cool morning air touched my bruised cheek like a reminder of the world outside, the one Terrence had tried to shrink and control. And standing before me were the three people I had chosen carefully, the only three who knew everything: Detective Hartwell, Pastor Jerome, and my sister Denise. And they did not speak, not at first, because the sight of my face told them more than any words could, and I felt their shock settle into a quiet, righteous fury. And that fury was not loud, it was steady and powerful, and for the first time in a long while I felt protected, not by fear but by truth. And Detective Hartwell gave a small nod, a silent "Are you ready?" and I stepped back to let them in. And as their footsteps crossed the threshold, I felt the energy of the house shift like a storm rolling into a valley. And Terrence appeared in the dining room doorway, his skin pale, his breath shallow, his eyes darting between us like a man cornered by his own past. And he tried to form a smile, but it cracked halfway and disappeared. And he tried to speak, but the words tangled somewhere between guilt, anger, and disbelief, and the silence stretched across the room until it became heavy enough to bend the air. And I stood there letting him feel every ounce of what he had done, because today was not about screaming or chaos, it was about truth walking straight into the room he thought he owned and refusing to leave. And the moment Denise saw my face, she placed a trembling hand over her chest and whispered, "Oh God, Vanessa," but I lifted my chin to show her that I was not broken, not anymore. This moment was mine. Terrence finally found his voice, but it was thin and shaky as he pointed at Detective Hartwell and said, "What is this? Why are you here? And why are all of you in my house?" But his questions carried no weight, because everyone could see the bruise he had placed on me, the split lip, the swelling, the damage he had believed would stay hidden behind closed doors. And Pastor Jerome stepped forward quietly with the calm of someone who had seen too much pain in too many homes, and he said, "Vanessa called us." And that simple sentence hit Terrence harder than any accusation, because it meant I had stepped out of his shadow and into the open. And he hated that I had reached for help. He hated that the world was now looking at him instead of worshiping his version of the truth. And Detective Hartwell kept her voice steady as she asked me, "Vanessa, do you feel safe right now?" And I answered with a single word, "No." And that one word changed everything, because it stripped away every lie Terrence had wrapped around his image and around me, and he took a step forward like he wanted to reclaim control, but he hesitated when he saw Hartwell's hand resting near her cuffs, and in that hesitation I saw the truth of who he really was: not strong, not powerful, just a man who relied on fear to pretend he mattered. And I watched the realization wash over him that this time he could not intimidate his way out of the truth. The house felt different now, like every wall and floorboard had been waiting for this moment for years, and Terrence stood there shifting his weight from one foot to the other, searching for a version of himself that looked innocent but every second uncovered more of what he had done. And Detective Hartwell asked him directly, "Terrence, did you hit your wife last night?" And he opened his mouth to deny it, but the lie caught when his eyes landed on the bruise he created, the bruise he had smiled at earlier when he thought I was still under his control. And Denise stepped closer, crossing her arms with a strength I had not seen in her before. And she said, "Do not lie, we know." And Terrence looked at me, desperate, as though he believed I would save him one more time, like I always had, after every apology, after every promise that collapsed within a week. And I held his gaze steady, letting him know without a single word that the cycle was over. And Pastor Jerome whispered softly, "Sometimes a man condemns himself with silence." And Terrence must have understood the truth in those words, because for the first time in the 18 years I had known him, he looked small, not physically, but in the way a person shrinks when their cruelty can no longer hide. And the air in the house tightened as everyone waited for what would come next, and for once the waiting did not hurt, because I knew I was not alone, not this morning, not ever again. Terrence backed away like the walls were closing in on him, and the steady gaze of Detective Hartwell made him twitch, because he finally knew this was no misunderstanding and no emotional moment that he could twist into another apology. And I watched from the doorway, feeling a strange calm settle over me, because I had spent so many nights trembling, yet now the trembling belonged to him, and he kept mumbling that this was all blown out of proportion, that we could fix this privately. But his words floated in the air without weight, because no one in the room believed him anymore, not even him. And I felt the first real breath of freedom fill my lungs, as if the house itself was letting me go. Pastor Jerome stepped gently to my side and asked me if I wanted to speak, and for a moment my throat tightened, because for years I had swallowed every truth, every bruise, every silent plea for help. But now my voice rose from a place I thought had died, and I said, "I am done being hurt, I am done being afraid." And the words rolled out of me like a storm that had waited too long. And Terrence stared at me like he was looking at a stranger, because he had never seen me stand tall and unshaken. And that new strength in me frightened him more than any badge or witness ever could, because it meant he had lost the only power he ever had. Detective Hartwell asked me again if I wanted to file charges, and I nodded, and Terrence gasped like the air had been punched out of him, because he truly believed I would protect him even now, even after everything. And that belief showed just how deeply he had underestimated me, and underestimated the quiet rage that grows in a woman who has been hurt too long. And Denise stepped closer, resting her hand on my arm, her eyes shining with fierce pride, because she had waited years to see me choose myself. In the moment felt almost holy, like I was crossing a line that once terrified me, but now felt like salvation. Terrence tried to speak again, claiming he never meant to hurt me, but the words rang empty, because excuses cannot rewrite bruises, and false tenderness cannot erase nights of fear. And Detective Hartwell gave him one clear chance to tell the truth, but he just shook his head, insisting that the real problem was stress or misunderstanding, anything except accountability. And that was all she needed, because she stepped forward and told him to turn around. And I watched his eyes widen, as if reality had finally broken through the surface he had been hiding under, and for the first time he tasted the same helplessness he had forced on me. When Detective Hartwell placed her hand on his arm, Terrence jerked back like a cornered animal, demanding that no one touch him, but she remained calm, unmoved, unshaken, and her steady authority made him shrink. And she repeated the command, and this time he obeyed, because the truth had finally cut through his arrogance. And as she guided him toward the center of the room, the click of her cuffs echoed like a verdict, like a chapter ending, and I felt my chest grow lighter, not because he was being taken away, but because I knew I would never again wake up afraid of the footsteps coming down the hall. As the cuffs locked around his wrists, Terrence stared at me with wide, trembling eyes, not filled with love or remorse, but with disbelief that I had truly chosen myself over him. And that disbelief told me everything I needed to know, because he had never loved me as a partner, only as something to control. And his voice cracked when he said, "Vanessa, please do not do this." But the plea felt hollow after years of silence, cries, and broken promises. And I raised my chin steady, unafraid, and said, "This is not something I am doing to you, this is something I am doing for me." Detective Hartwell read him his rights, and every word felt like another chain breaking free from my body, like each sentence was freeing me from years of whispered apologies and forced forgiveness. And Terrence kept shaking his head, trying to twist the story, trying to remind me of good days and good moments, but his reminders were small and fragile compared to the mountain of pain he had built. And Pastor Jerome watched him quietly, offering no Sympathy, because even forgiveness begins only where truth stands, and today truth stood fully in the open, afraid of nothing. The room felt warmer somehow, as if the sunlight itself had been waiting for this moment, and Denise wiped a small tear from her cheek. But it was not a tear of sadness, rather a tear of relief, because she had prayed for this for so long, prayed that I would find my strength again, and she whispered, "I am proud of you," and the words wrapped around me like armor, and I felt taller and steadier, because sometimes strength does not come from fighting back, it comes from finally choosing not to live broken anymore. Terrence tried to take one final stand, claiming I was exaggerating, claiming he had never truly meant to hurt me, claiming this arrest was a mistake, but his voice had lost its sharpness and its authority, and even he seemed unsure of the lies he was telling, because the truth had already filled the room too loudly to ignore. And Detective Hartwell asked if he had anything else to say, and he just stared at the floor, shoulders sagging under the weight of his own actions, and that image of him defeated became the final fracture in the cage he once built around me. As she walked him toward the door, the house felt bigger, like the walls were breathing again after years of tension and silence, and Terrence glanced back at me one last time, hoping maybe I would step forward and stop this, hoping maybe fear would pull me back into his orbit, but I stood still, unwavering, because fear no longer lived in me. And the silence I returned to him was the strongest answer I had ever given, and in that silence, he finally understood that the woman he once broke would never belong to him again. When the door opened, the bright morning light spilled into the house, and it felt like the world outside had been reborn, waiting for me to step into it. And as Terrence was led across the porch, he tried one last desperate attempt at control, whispering over his shoulder that I would regret this, but the threat sounded thin and weak, because he no longer held any power. And I watched him walk down the steps and into the patrol car, and the closing door of that car felt like the closing door of a long, painful chapter that should have ended years ago. When the police car pulled away, the quiet felt different, not heavy, not suffocating, but full of possibility, like the air itself was healing. And Denise wrapped her arms around me, and for the first time in years I did not feel fragile in her embrace. I felt solid, like a woman rebuilt. And Pastor Jerome placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, saying, "Today you chose life and you chose peace," and those words echoed through me like a truth I had been waiting to hear, because surviving is one thing, but choosing to live again is something far more powerful. Detective Hartwell stayed behind to finish the report and asked me to describe the events of the night before, and as I spoke I did not tremble, I did not break, I simply told the truth plainly, clearly, like a woman who was no longer afraid of her own story. And with each detail shared, the shadows inside me loosened their hold, and when she finally closed her notebook, she looked me in the eye and said, "You did the right thing," and I felt that truth settle deep within me like a warm, steady light. When everyone left, I remained standing in the quiet house, the same house where I had been hurt, where I had cried, where I had whispered prayers for strength. But now the house felt like my space again, not a prison, not a battlefield, but a place where healing could start. And I walked to the dining table, the wedding china still there untouched, and I lifted one plate, feeling its delicate weight, and I realized that I no longer needed reminders of a marriage that had died long before today. And I placed the plate aside gently, as if laying the past to rest. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside, letting the warm sunlight fall across my bruised cheek, and for the first time in years the world felt open and wide and possible. And I knew the bruise would fade and the split lip would heal, but the strength I found today would never leave me. And I whispered to myself, the knock at 8:12 was not the sound of his end, it was the sound of my beginning. And with that truth burning bright inside me, I took my first real breath of freedom and stepped forward into the life I should have had all along. Vanessa Clark spent years trapped in a violent marriage with Terrence, a man who controlled her through fear, isolation, and physical abuse. But everything changed on the morning she woke up with a bruised face and a new resolve burning inside her. For the first time, she stopped feeling afraid and started feeling ready. She prepared her house quietly, laying out wedding china and moving through the rooms with a calm that felt almost sacred. When Terrence came downstairs, mocking the pain he caused, she did not argue. She simply waited, because at exactly 8:12 a.m. knock hit their door, a knock Terrence never expected, and one Vanessa had planned with cold precision. The story follows 20 escalating moments after that knock as Vanessa executes her escape and exposes Terrence's crimes. The knock turns out to be law enforcement responding to the evidence she secretly collected over months, including recordings, bruised photographs, and hidden documents. Terrence tries to intimidate her, twist the truth, and manipulate the officers, but the trap has already closed around him. As he becomes desperate, Vanessa becomes stronger. She recounts years of silent suffering and the slow transformation of her fear into strategy. Through long interrogations, emotional flashbacks, and the final confrontation, Terrence realizes the power he believed he owned has completely reversed. Vanessa stands firm, refusing to shrink ever again. The authorities arrest Terrence at the same time Vanessa steps into her new life, leaving behind the house where she once felt like a prisoner. The knock at 8:12 becomes the moment she is finally freed, and the moment Terrence's abusive dominance ends forever. The story closes with Vanessa choosing healing independence and the promise of a future she was once too scared to even imagine.